Welcome back to Bammerhab, Season 4, Episode 12. Bammerhab is a podcast about one writer's attempt to dig deeper into God's Word by exploring the Greek and Hebrew words inside it. I'm SDG Morgan, and I'll be your tour guide around this dig. Today's word is Greek, and it is magoi in Matthew 2:1, and it means magicians. However, since it's Christmas time, we're going to tell a little story before we get to our word. A long, long time ago, just before the American Civil War, there was an American clergyman from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who wrote a song you definitely already know. This man had started his career as a journalist and a lawyer, but lately he turned into a musician. His name was John Henry Hopkins Jr., and he wrote the music and lyrics to one of my favorite Christmas carols, We Three Kings of Orient Are. He later published in Pennsylvania on the year of the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. Its beautiful, haunting lyrics do make one key mistake, though. We have no idea how many magoi there were. The traditional number of 3 kings is based on the 3 gifts they brought, but it is nowhere stated in the text that there were 3. All we know is it is plural. Magoi is plural. There were probably far more magicians than just a trio. And these magicians definitely weren't kings. That was a much later invention that was elaborated upon during the Middle Ages. But yes, this band did come from the East, or the Orient, and the text does call them magoi, magicians, wizards, euphemistically wise men rather than wizards. But these wizards were not wise, and they aren't the heroes in the Christmas story, but rather a band of ambitious bunglers who, professing to be wise men, actually make a series of foolish mistakes that bring about bloodshed and disaster. Only afterwards do they stumble onto the truth, and there they are shown great grace after they fumble their mission. Matthew is the only one of the Gospels to include the magicians in his description. Luke does not. He instead focuses on how the infant Jesus was dedicated in the temple that Herod built, in accordance with Mosaic law, and then he receives 2 prophetic witnesses, whose prophecies occur right under Herod's nose, and yet escape his notice. So for years, Herod would have no idea about the infant Messiah living only 6 miles south of him. But many did know the truth. Anyone who listened to the witnesses of the shepherds, or those who heard the prophecies given in the temple. But if there's one thing we know about Herod, he wasn't in the habit of discussing much with shepherds, and he could not care less about the prophecies of a couple of old kooks in a temple. After all, shepherds got a specific revelation, and they didn't miss their way. They also kept everyone in Bethlehem safe for years. Old Anna and old Simeon hadn't bungled their message into Herod's hearing. God the Father wanted to tell the world openly what he was doing, and he knew exactly how to share that news. However, this caravan of bungling wizards from the East, while incredibly knowledgeable and apparently reverent, were the ones who would bring the message right into the face of the one who shouldn't hear it. And they would give that message legitimacy that Herod would understand. Gold, and all the other sacred markers of kingship being brought by wise and official academics of another great empire to the east. This caravan would have likely been an unofficial delegation, and yet if it were coming from the east, then these would have been citizens of that old arch enemy of Rome, the Parthian Empire. The rulers of the Parthian Empire would often deal with India to the east and the Chinese Han Empire further to the east, and they had been fighting huge, glorious battles with the Roman Empire to the west. These huge, glorious battles had much death, much bloodshed, but little territorial consequence. But this Parthian Empire sat right in the middle of the great Roman Empire to the west and the mighty Han Empire to the east. And when a single poor baby boy was born in a manger in Bethlehem, the old emperor Phraates IV sat tired on his throne in Parthia. The Parthians had propped up Herod's predecessor, Antigonus the Hasmonean, the last actually Jewish king in Israel. But the Romans wanted a good place to wage war on the east. They needed a beachhead to attack the Parthian Empire. And so, Israel held great strategic value. So Caesar's ally, Mark Antony, had kicked out Antigonus the Hasmonean, the last actually Jewish king of Israel, because he was a Parthian puppet. He beheaded Antigonus the Hasmonean, and then Mark Antony installed his own puppet king, Herod the Great. But that was 30 years ago, and now Herod was old and he was tired, and there were many things that could incite him to mad paranoia. But the one thing that could incite him fastest was a delegation coming from the lands of the great empire who had funded the king who he had usurped from the throne. Herod was an Edomite. He was descended from Isaac through Esau, but he was not descended from Jacob. He was not Jewish. And he was very sensitive to that fact. So how foolish was this caravan of wizards to go waltzing into the capital of the one man guaranteed to panic at their public arrival? Not only did they put all of their heads in grave danger of being separated from their bodies, yet to waltz in Jerusalem like they did, they were either supremely confident or supremely foolish or both. So why doesn't Luke mention these bunglers? Well, at that time, Luke would have been well aware of Matthew's gospel, which many historians surmise would have been the first gospel written in Hebrew until it was later translated into Greek. We only have the Greek copy, so some people think it was Mark. There's debate, because Mark was the first written Greek gospel. However, that's moot for this discussion. But we do know that Luke was a learned doctor, but not an eyewitness himself. So he carefully interviewed as many eyewitnesses as he could, and we can surmise from all he knew that he must have interviewed Mary, as he includes several details that only Mary could have known. And so, as someone who had weathered so much trauma, it's not surprising that Mary would not want to dwell on the massacre of the innocents, nor on the flight to Egypt, which was most likely not for years but only for months, as the best dates for Jesus' birth is around 6 BC, and Herod died miserably from an unknown illness around 4 BC in the same year as he ordered the massacre of the innocents. But Mary would have known these children that got killed. And God did avenge upon Herod's head the lives of the innocents killed, but for the sake of the bunglers, and for the sake of the innocents accidentally slaughtered, Mary probably wouldn't want to have relived that particular part of the story. And she probably would have already known about Matthew's gospel, which again was traditionally the first one written, albeit in Hebrew. So Mary seems to have skipped over these particularly traumatic months and focused on the wise witnesses, the shepherds, Anna and Simeon, those who shared the good news without foolishly telling the one person who shouldn't hear it, the cruel, paranoid, and aged Herod. Why rehash the deaths of the little ones? It is also interesting to note that Matthew says the wise men visited Mary and Joseph in their house in Bethlehem. That means, after the witness of the shepherds, and especially the ancient and revered holy prophets Simeon and Anna, the citizens of Bethlehem had changed their tune, and they had welcomed the couple into their tiny town. For 2 years, life had stabilized. Joseph and Mary apparently had a house. But then came a caravan of bungling wizards who accidentally upset the entire delicate balance. So why does Matthew mention these bunglers at all? Well, a stopped clock is right twice a day, and these syncretistic practitioners of the magic arts had stumbled onto a truth, and they brought great gifts that soon would become necessary to solve the chaos they'd accidentally unleashed. You see, these wise men, these wizards, these magicians, had a vague revelation of a timing coming due, but they missed their way and stumbled towards the capital rather than the suburb of Bethlehem, 6 miles distant. They looked to the scholars for information. These scholars had the information handy, but they hadn't acted on it. They were only 6 miles away from Bethlehem, but they hadn't walked there. They hadn't gone there. In fact, these wise men were likely from Babylon, the headquarters of these kinds of magic arts, well known for magoi, magicians, wizards, and being from that wealthy and powerful town, they naturally gravitated towards power and audiences with kings, wrongly assuming that greatness could only arise out of affluence and influence. It's also been surmised that possibly these wizards were syncretistic Jews who had merged Judaic thought with the native religions of Babylon. What is syncretistic, you might ask? Well, it's just a fancy word for all mixed up. Samaritans were also syncretistic Jews who mixed in the local paganism with bits of Moses and a little bit of the law. In our day, syncretistic would sound like saying, all roads lead to God, or Jesus and the Buddha were both great teachers of wisdom. That sort of thing. That's syncretistic. You're mixing stuff that doesn't mix. Now, if you read some of the academic papers, you'll read many secular historians sneering that clearly Herod never killed any babies because Josephus didn't mention it in his history. But for a town the size of Bethlehem, the massacre of the innocents would have only killed a dozen or so children, if that. If Josephus cared about events as numerically small as a dozen or so babies dying, he would have been writing thousands and thousands of books to keep up with Herod's cruelties. There were tens of thousands of soldiers dying frequently in great battles under great men who only got a small sliver of a mention. So who would mention a handful of infants? Besides, Herod often assassinated his own sons and assassinated other great members of his own royal family because he was paranoid they might be conspiring against him. So why would any secular historian mention a handful of peasant babies in their great royal history? However, it was a significant enough event for Matthew to grieve over. He knew that these foolish magicians did not mean to alert Herod to kill the babies, and yet that's exactly what they did. Traditionally, Matthew began his ministry in Judea before moving on to Ethiopia much later in life after he wrote his gospel. But as an apostle, deep in the life of the Judean church, Matthew was very likely to have known personally those who were affected by this act of Herod's cruelty. And of course, Matthew, as a very observant Jew, he can't have missed Herod's accidental connection between these vicious killing of a dozen or more infants and Pharaoh's massacre of thousands or more Hebrew infants before the Exodus. He knew that his readers would have noticed this fact. And that's why I think Matthew saw fit to bring into the story the evidence of these syncretistic Jews who also practiced pagan magic. Because Matthew knew the prophecy of the 70 weeks as well as any observant Jew at the time would have. What is the prophecy of 70 weeks, you ask? Well, in Daniel 9, an angel explains to Daniel that the Messiah would be coming in 69 sevens, or 69 weeks. And then the last week was going to be a doozy. But leaving all that aside for the moment, it was widely and correctly understood that weeks were referring to years. 7 years. So 69 times 7 equals 483. And it had been nearly 450 years since that clock had started to tick. And there was a large Jewish community in Babylon at this time in history. They were the folks who had never returned from the exile. And we also know that Daniel was made the chief of the magicians for his services both to the Babylonians and the Persians. And so he would have left a legacy there, an echo, perhaps sort of an ancient academy, a group of syncretistic Jewish wizards who looked to Daniel to establish their legitimacy. And this is my guess for what inspired the magician wizard caravan who came to Jerusalem. It's very likely that this prophecy of weeks was the spur that moved these syncretistic Jewish wizards to leave Babylon and return to the only Jewish city they knew anything about, Jerusalem. They were likely also convinced to action with some other astrological sign, perhaps the conjunction of planets or a comet, which they were certain presaged the arrival of the future king. And they weren't alone. What was mentioned frequently by even Roman historians was that era the general pervasive idea all throughout the East was that a Jewish Messiah would soon arise and soon have universal kingship. Again, this was likely because of the general knowledge all throughout the East of Daniel's prophecy of weeks. Even grizzled and cynical Roman historians like Suetonius and Tacitus, who never bothered to mention any small potatoes and couldn't fathom the Jewish religion, for them to both mention this independently meant that the idea was certainly very widespread and very commonplace. Again, this is because of Daniel's prophecy of weeks, which was a ticking time clock until the advent of the Messiah, and there wasn't much time left on the clock. So there's a little bit of ambiguity as to when the clock starts ticking, as the angel said it would start when the word went out to rebuild Jerusalem. So does that mean from the time the Persian emperor decreed that, or the time when the city walls were rebuilt, or the time when the temple was rebuilt? Those are the three potential start points that had different adherents at the time, but each of these start points were within 30 years of each other. So even those who disagreed precisely when, they were all expectant that someone, and someone very soon, would fulfill Daniel's predictions. These syncretistic Jewish wizards also agreed, but they wanted to get in on the ground floor by flattering and honoring this great king before anyone else could. That's why they bumbled into Jerusalem, apparently thinking there would have been a line of admirers that they could have gotten into. Instead, they found a city in terror of its mad king, and they blundered right into the middle of his deadly political quagmire. No doubt, Herod also knew about this Danielic prophecy of weeks, and as an Edomite, he knew he was not eligible to become the Jewish Messiah. So if he couldn't reign supreme, then nobody was. And he'd yet to see any prophecy that didn't give way to the slashing metal of a bloody sword. So with all due respect to that Pittsburgh clergyman and the haunting and beautiful lyrics of that wonderful carol, We Three Kings, it's very likely that the real Magi were bumbling, partially well-meaning, flattering, ambitious royal courtiers headquartered in Babylon who played the part of the accidental truth-teller Balaam from the Old Testament. But unlike that money-grubbing false prophet of the Exodus who accidentally preached the truth, God showed incredible grace to these Magi by warning them in the exact medium that they would understand: dreams. An angel warned these Magi not to return to Jerusalem because if they did, Herod would kill them. Still, these Magi's incorrect assumptions about a real prophecy accidentally caused bloodshed and then brought about judgment on an incredibly corrupt king. Because God is not mocked, and he will use evil to advance good. So these Magi also serve to further God's plan by accidentally fulfilling several prophetic verses from both Hosea and Jeremiah, as Matthew highlights, and the obvious Exodus parallel. So this caravan of wizards fled out of Herod's grasp. Unfortunately, about a dozen babies did not escape. But in the eyes of God, this massacre of the innocents was a step too far, and Herod would die shortly thereafter, never knowing that he missed killing the one baby he was trying to get. The Messiah survived just fine, and most of church history has assumed that the flight into Egypt was actually paid for by the gifts of the bungling Magi, who did escape with their necks intact, but left quite ignorant of who this Messiah truly was. So the real Magi made a mess. But there's also something to be said for the fictional ones of this beautiful carol written by that Pittsburgh clergyman. These fictional three kings represent so many real pilgrims who have ventured onward to Christ out of field and fountain, moor and mountain, following yonder star. And it's in that vein that I want to end with two poems from Rosa Gilbert. Poems about a Dominican believer living abroad and raising her children abroad, but always following yonder star until it finally leads her home. I will let Rosa take it from here.
Longing for the Promised Land, read by Rosalia Gilbert. I come from a land of flowing mangoes and cafe, flowing salt water and coconuts, flowing rice paddies and sugar canes, flowing saman trees and flamboyanes. But everything that bursts with life in this land of mine can't help but wither, can't help but die. So I know this is not my promised land. My promised land has no zip code. It cannot be reached by water, foot, or sky. The promised land promised to all who believe is not a territory to be claimed, nor is it marked by foreign flags. The promise is only you. My eyes have yet to see it. My lips are yet to taste the feast prepared for me But here, in the depths of my longing, I can climb the mountain, look over the land like Moses did, and catch a glimpse at my eternal dwelling place. And maybe it would flow with salt water, cafe, mangoes, coconuts, rice paddies, sugar canes, saman trees, and flamboyanes too. Or maybe not. But one thing is true. This promised land will flow with you. On Raising a Homesick Child, read by Rosalia Gilbert. I am raising a homesick child who cries over leaving her abuela, an ocean behind, and her grandma a few states over. I am raising a homesick child who savors the sun on her winter white skin and quickens her tiny feet whenever she spots a shore. I am raising a homesick child whose heart yearns for everyone and everything that is away. Growing grass she longs to touch, ocean wind she longs to feel. I am raising a homesick child who doesn't realize yet that she, like me, is a pilgrim, that she, like me, feels the grief of separation. I am raising a homesick child who will one day ask after the ache in her bones, and I will be there to let her know it is a longing for an eternal place.
Thank you, Rosa, for sharing those. Rosa has just released a new book of her poetry, which includes those two she just read. If you feel so led, please help to support Rosa's work by not only checking out her book, but by suggesting it to any friends who might enjoy it. I'll include a link to her book and website in the show notes. And as always, I hope you'll join me again on the next episode and beyond. In the meantime, go dig a little bit deeper in the Word. And remember, in Christ, in Him, the Lord has set us free and put our feet into a broad and spacious place. Psalm 31:8 states, "You have not given me into the hands of the enemy, but you have set my feet in a spacious place." And that phrase, a spacious place, is the Hebrew word bamerhab. And the Word of God is also a huge and spacious place, a place just waiting to be explored. So let's go exploring. If you like what you heard and you get a chance, please rate, like, and subscribe, or share this episode with your friends. For more information about bamerhab, go to www.sdgmorgan.com or visit the bamerhab Substack page. A special thanks to my friend Aaron Woodard for the graphic design of the show. Also, don't forget to check out this episode's show notes below.